Editorial Director of Epicenter NYC. I'm also the host of the podcast Beyond Black History Month, which is returning for its third season in the next few weeks, which I'm very excited about. I'm also the chair of NEBJ's LGBTQ+ Task Force and a board member at NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ+ Journalists. So this panel is going to be on But the Neighbors Seem Just Like Us, Voting Patterns Across Communities. And before I tell you about the panel, I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves. I'm so excited to moderate this, and I'm so excited to hear what everyone has to say. So we'll start with Jennifer.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jen Taylor Skinner. I am the founder and the host of the Electorette podcast. And the Electorette, I founded it shortly after the 2016 election, sometime in 2017, actually, after seeing the way the media was covering Hillary Clinton and that election. And what I wanted to do was, center the voices of women in politics. That's something that we've never done, and we've never done really well. I was really kind of dismayed at the media coverage of Hillary Clinton. And you'd think that after the 2016 election, we would have learned some messages. We would have learned some lessons, rather. And we saw some of the same treatment with Kamala Harris, talking about her laugh and the way that she talks. And so what the Electorette does is we deliver political information through the lens of women, not just women's issues, not just abortion rights, but the economy, climate change, and all of those issues through the lens of women. So that's the Electorette.
Hi, everybody. My name's Randall Yip. I'm the founder and editor of AsAm News, the only daily digital news site focused on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, which includes South Asians, Filipinos, and Pacific Islanders, which explains what I'm doing up here. I was in mainstream, it's kind of a full circle moment. When I was in high school and college, I worked in ethnic media. And then when I graduated from Berkeley, I got into mainstream media in television, and I stuck around for 40 years. But after 30 years, I started feeling like I hadn't done what I would set out to do, which diversify the content in the media. So I did AsAm News as a passion project, a one-person passion project, while I continued to work in mainstream media, and it just continued to grow. So after 10 years with more than 20 volunteers, we officially became a nonprofit, and we started hiring people. So that's our story.
Hi, everyone. My name is Krysta Villeda. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Pulso. Pulso is a impact-focused Latino media outlet focused on helping Latinos understand ourselves, each other, and the world around us. Before working at Pulso, I joined Pulso in 2020. Before that, I was a strategy consultant for tech, media, and telecom here in DC at a boutique firm. And I'm a proud Salvadorian and Guatemalan, born and raised in LA, and I've lived here in DC for the past 12 years.
I'm Solomon Jones. I am the morning host on WURD Radio, Black Talk Media in Philadelphia. I'm also a columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, an author, and appear frequently on CNN.
Buju Manadokwe Indigenous Lolan Donjaba, Waganaxing Odawanda, Nekwejangada. My name is Neely. I'm actually the political editor for Native News Online. And if I don't seem quite as accomplished as my fellow panelists, it's because I'm not. I'm quite young. For context, I graduated from Michigan State with my bachelor's just last December. I'm actually filling in for my boss and close friend, our publisher and editor of Native News, Levi Rickert. Love him, so I just want to give him the proper recognition. Native News Online wouldn't be where it is without him. He works day and night. Honestly, he works harder than I do, I'd say. I sometimes will get a text from him, and it'll be from at 2 a.m., and he'll be like, "Hey, Neely, I just saw this. Can you read this? Read my story over?" And I'm like, "Okay, thank you, Levi." But I'm excited to be here to talk about election patterns and how the Native community specifically voted and turned out this election. Because that is what I focused on for the last almost half a year now. And so, yeah, that's who I am.
Okay, first off, I've seen your work. You are quite accomplished. Don't ever say that again.
For me, I just kind of fell into journalism. My degree is actually in policy. I originally wanted to be kind of in the political sphere, and then I went to college and kind of sort of moved away from it, and now I'm back right in the thick of it all for this 2024 election.
And what a time to be in the thick of it all.
Right.
Which leads perfectly into what we're going to talk about today. So this panel is going to discuss the concerns of various communities and how this past presidential election and the candidates, whether or not they addressed any of those concerns or they didn't. If you spend any time on TikTok or social media, you know that this election also caused quite the division between communities that I think saw some amount of solidarity after 2020 and after the George Floyd protests. We're going to talk about all of that. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to do Q&A, I think, around our third-ish question. So there's going to be a mic somewhere that will be passed around if you have any questions. But I want to jump into our first question. As we think about this past election and what we saw, what we expected, and what we didn't expect, what do you think still needs to change around our coverage of communities of color? And when you answer that, if you could answer both as community journalists, but also mainstream media coverage, what do we need to see changing?
I think you have to realize that communities of color are not all the same. That we don't have the same experience, we don't have the same history, we don't have the same circumstance right now, that they are literally separate communities whose interests converge on certain issues. And so when you lump us all in together, I think you're doing a disservice to those communities, and I think you're doing a disservice to your outlet. We are not all the same, we don't have the same interests, and as media, we have to stop acting like we do.
I agree with that. I even think within the Native community as well, I think a lot of people who aren't well-versed in tribal politics or just any issues in the Native communities at all, or maybe even don't even know we still exist. That is very common, believe it or not. I think a common misconception, again, is that we are all a monolith and all tribal communities are going to vote the exact same way. Both campaigns kind of did use that narrative where, okay, we're going to reach out to the Native people because they're all going to vote the same way. But in Native News Online, we did 4 polls across the election season this year, and found that the data actually, is really different in the sense that we looked at both those who live on the reservation, those who live off the reservation, and off reservation also means do you live in an urban setting or do you live in a rural setting? Because those things all play very deeply into how you're going to vote, the issues you care most about. And so I agree with that. I think a common, disservice that we as media do is lumping communities all together, and that is kind of my beef with the term BIPOC. Is a lot of times organizations, nonprofits, communities, et cetera, what you have it, will use BIPOC, but then as someone a part of the I part, they're not, when they say BIPOC, they actually just mean maybe Black communities, or maybe they mean Asian communities. But BIPOC specifically, the B and the I, are separate from POC because Indigenous people have a very special and unique set of issues. And I think the one similarity that we all share, though, is we're all sufferers of colonization. And so I think that's some common ground that I think media can try and play on, while also honoring the uniqueness of each of our communities.
I'm glad you brought that up because, BIPOC, right, there's 5 letters in there representing all of us. So we do have commonalities. But I think what happens sometimes in ethnic media, and I'll point to myself, is that we were very Asian American focused. Everything we talked to Asian Americans to get their opinion. And we kind of stayed in our silo. And as we have evolved, we've tried to open ourselves up to look more at the intersectionality between Asian Americans and other communities, to look at the intersectionality between, say in the immigration issue down in San Diego, when Biden cracked down on the asylum seekers coming into the United States from Mexico. We went down there and we talked to not only the Asian community, but also the Hispanic community and the African American community, and asked them how they felt about the crackdown by Biden and whether that was going to impact whether they could support him or not. And what we found out was that most said, we're not crazy about the crackdown, but given the alternative, maybe we'll overlook that. So I really think as we look at each other and how we interact with each other, we can look at our commonalities, like the term BIPOC suggests, but also the differences, as the term, we're not all one monolith, right? We're all different. We have different opinions. Even within the Asian American community, we have different opinions about different issues. And I think all of that needs to be covered.
So before we move on to our next question, I just want to quickly ask, when this conversation has come up before with other journalists, I've heard a lot of the same thing, we are not the same, stop lumping us in together. But what I often hear, especially from younger journalists, is that, they have a minute and a half to tell a story. So how do you tell a diverse story that includes everyone in a minute and a half? Or there's one culture reporter that covers everybody. So how do you do this, especially in mainstream media? How do you actually see our differences in all of the constraints that is in traditional media?
You actually have to devote the time, energy, and money and resources to doing that. So like you said, well, sometimes there's only one cultural reporter, so add more. And so I think it is very important, though, to recognize the limitations of a lot of media outlets, specifically as someone who comes from a smaller, local, but national covering media outlet. We can't always get all those stories. We can't always, touch on all those communities. There's over 500 federally recognized tribes in just America alone, in the United States alone, and that's not even counting state-recognized tribes or tribes who don't have recognition status at all. And so, as one person, a part of a team of 4 or 5, or at most 10, it is very difficult. But I think part of it is, okay, let's say you have a minute and a half. Are you devoting your energy and your fullest intent into that a minute and a half? Because a lot can be done in a minute and a half. And so I think it's about how are you showing up in those stories for those communities? Are you just going to those communities, or maybe not even going there at all? Are you talking to those communities? Are you hearing their issues? And then are you doing your best to kind of give time to that story? And I think just being mindful and intentional is where we start.
I think the talk radio format gives us at WURD, it gives us the space to allow the story to breathe and to hear from the audience about what they think, because really it's about them. It's more, for me, it's more than telling a story. It's about representing the community that you're talking to. When we talk about Black Talk Media, it's not just about talking. It's about figuring out ways to solve some of these issues, figuring out ways to make our community whole, figuring out ways to tell our story from the perspective of the people that it's about. I think one of the problems with what happens in mainstream media is that you have people who aren't from the community, don't know anything about the community, don't care to know, don't need to know, trying to tell the stories of these communities. It's ridiculous, and it comes out that way.
I want to add to that. I think at Pulso, what we focus on is the kind of storytelling that we're doing. So we often talk about how the hyper-specific is often universal, and what that means is, for example, Latinos are not a monolith is a phrase that we say so often that at this point we laugh about it because everyone always wants to talk about what Latinos are doing in terms of voting. Yeah, we are all pretty different, right? Like, we regionally different, generationally, whether you're an immigrant or not. There's many, many countries that make up the term Latino. So we all have different voting patterns, but often what we do with our content is we focus on a very specific experience. So one example that I can think of is, how do Latinos say this word in Spanish? And there's like 20 different ways to say that. And we can bring in a lot of these more serious conversations through focusing on something really specific that even if it doesn't apply to you specifically, you can still say like, oh yeah, that's so relatable, that's so funny, that's so accessible. So I wanted to say that we focus on the way we're telling stories. I think definitely broadening representation is important, but also making your content or your news accessible. We are a social first media outlet, so all of our content goes out on like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. We have a podcast. We don't actually invest so much in our website right now, and we use a lot of content creators and video. We're like a video heavy outlet. to make these like 1 minute, 90-second videos that are focusing on news, but maybe relating it to like history or pop culture, because what we see with our audience often is that craving to know more history and know more about our own stories. So often people will say to us like, oh my God, I never learned this in school. That's so crazy. I can't believe that. And so there's a way to like, to connect the past and the present, right? To tell history in a way where you're speaking to current events or news, but in a way that's a little bit more digestible, a little bit more accessible, in a way that people want to hear it, either with a content creator or just like a really specific, funny example, emotional. So just wanted to add that as well.
And I'll just add on that I agree with Solomon in that I think podcasting is very similar to the radio platform in that you can give someone an entire hour, right, to get into the weeds of their issue. And, you'd be surprised at how many women are, have spent their entire careers focused on gun reform or criminal justice reform. And they're just really grateful to have an audience listen to them for an hour and a half, right, to talk about those issues in depth. So yeah, it's very similar to radio.
It does feel like sometimes that we've been talking about how to improve how we report on marginalized communities or communities of color forever, literally forever. How do we move the needle?
I think people have to tell their own stories. I think that's the allure of social media, right? And it's interesting because the more produced something is, what I've noticed is that people gravitate away from that and towards something that looks raw. Right. Don Lemon on the last panel was talking about having his dogs barking in the background and people liking that.
They do.
Because it's real, right? And so I think when people have the opportunity to tell their own stories, there's an authenticity to it. And I think that's what is drawing people towards social media and kind of away from traditional media.
And I think just as important about telling our own stories is we have to raise our voices. Because oftentimes in newsroom, especially in the smaller markets, there might be one African American in the entire newsroom, one Hispanic. If you're lucky, there might be one Asian in the newsroom. And oftentimes these people can feel alone. I mean, we've all had that feeling, right? When we felt like we're the only ones in the room and everyone's looking at us. So we have to learn to speak up, but not only for our own communities, but for other communities as well. So when someone mentions a story about the African American community, and I may not be African American, but I can relate to what that person is saying, I chime in too and say, that's a wonderful story, and here's why. Here's why our audience needs to hear this. So I think we need to build coalitions within the newsrooms as well, not only among POC, but all people in that newsroom who may have the same sort of mentality and just work together.
We, back in the green room, we talked a little bit about voter suppression. Do you think, and I want you to share some of the things we spoke about, but do you think when you hear, this coalition we need to build, that would have helped the way that we covered voter suppression in this past election?
I'm not really sure. I mean, voter suppression has been an issue for since this country has had voting,
forever.
right? It's been forever,
topic,
right?
yeah.
But there are a couple of specific things that have happened in recent history that I don't think have gotten enough coverage. For example, we talk about Black women voting, right? Black women came out 92% for Harris in this past election. And someone mentioned earlier when we talk about voter behavior that people are broke, right? It's this idea of like economic anxiety. Well, no one's more broke than Black women. Yet somehow we still somehow do the right thing when it comes to election. On top of that, we are probably the most group that's been affected by voter suppression. There was a study that came out, I think it was earlier last year in 2024, actually 2 studies that came out from the National Academy of Sciences and then one from the Brennan Center for Justice that talked about Americans generally underestimate the role that voter suppression has had in the voting gap, right, the turnout gap in voter suppression. We cite things like, economic anxiety. We cite things like voter apathy. And that I personally find that really bothersome because, I've talked a lot about voter suppression on my podcast. There's a really great book by Carol Anderson, One Person, One Vote, which gives the history, a really great in-depth history of voter suppression in this country. But we underestimate those things. I'll if you're interested, I'll give you the link to the study. But one of the things that the study cites is the fact that voters, particularly voters from marginalized communities, are affected by something called friction, right? Voter friction. It's not easy to vote in this country. And if you're from a marginalized community, the harder it becomes for you to vote, right? If you don't have childcare, right? If you work in a job where you can't get a day off to go vote, right? If your voting location is far away from your home, right? Or if it's been closed. Following Shelby County versus Holder, which is a Supreme Court case that happened in 2013, which basically gutted the Voting Rights Act. Shortly after that, over the past, I think, 5 to 10 years, 100,000 voting locations have been closed in Black and brown neighborhoods. Think about how many millions of people that, along with disinformation, with new voter ID laws, and the fact that just generally we just don't have a level playing field for people to be able to access the ballot. All of those things come into play when we talk about, the voter turnout gap. So whenever someone talks about Black voter behavior specifically, or people of color, how they vote, if they're starting the conversation with, Black people just didn't turn out, or Black voter apathy, that's a non-starter for me, right? Just don't don't come to me with that. Let's talk about voter suppression and how we can pull that back, because we haven't really had that conversation adequately, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely don't think we talked about voter suppression enough in this past election. But likewise, I also don't think we talked enough about, after the election, this idea of the BIPOC coalition and whether or not it's dead. I don't know if you spent any time on the Black side of TikTok after the election, but you heard a lot of Black women frustrated with the ways that other communities of color voted. So that said, what fissures were exposed in your coverage of this past election? And I'd love to hear about a specific story that you published.
So I wrote a story after the election that basically said Black folks are on our own. And that's how it felt. I know that's what I saw reflected in the community. That's what I saw reflected on social media. But more than that, that's what I saw reflected in the numbers. 83% of Black voters voted for Kamala Harris. Latino support for Donald Trump went from 35% in 2020 to 43% in 2024, despite the fact that he was talking about, deporting all their relatives and friends and husbands and wives, and maybe we'll let your kids stay, right? You saw white women vote for Donald Trump in the same percentage. 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, despite the fact that he bragged about overturning Roe versus Wade. Let's not get into the being liable for sexual abuse in that case, and other things that he done that were specifically done to white women. I think when you looked at what was happening with some of the other communities, to me, it just exposed the fact that this coalition that we talked about was weak at best and non-existent at worst. But then there was, in the Black community, I think there were some issues with Black men. I had a brother call my show and say, I'm not voting for her because she's a woman. Period. And I appreciated his honesty, because I think it reflected what a lot of other Black men were not saying. Although most Black men voted for Kamala Harris, when you look at young Black men specifically who are getting their news from social media, their numbers for Donald Trump were a little bit shocking. And they did that despite the fact that he's talking about giving police greater immunity than they already have to do to young Black men what they've been doing already. And so I think that a lot of people voted, in my view, against their interests. But again, it exposed that this coalition we keep talking about might not exist.
I want to push back against that just a little. I hear what you're saying, so I'll just focus on the Asian community since that's what I know the best. And I hear the story you said about the Black man who said he could not vote for a woman. I had a similar story where an Indian American who grew up in San Francisco came up to me and says, Kamala Harris was never South Asian, was never Indian American until she ran for president. And my jaw dropped, given that Kamala Harris got her start in San Francisco politics first as a district attorney, then went on to be Attorney General of California, then went on to be California State U.S. Senator, and you're still saying that Kamala Harris was never Indian American until she ran for president? I was blown away. And earlier today we laughed about that NABJ incident where Trump said, is she Indian American? Was she African American? Was she African American before she's Indian American? Everyone laughed at that. But you know what? The people who laughed wasn't the people he was talking to. The people he was talking to were those that held that deep-seated prejudice within each of those communities. And he's a smart man. Give him credit. He knew that the election was super tight, that one vote can make a difference. And if he could just pick up a vote here, a vote there, a vote here, a vote there, he could win the election. And he proved to be correct. So like in the Asian American community, 5% more people in 2024 voted for Trump than they did in 2020. So then there's this narrative that Asian Americans suddenly are shifting rightward. Yes, but maybe not, because in 2016, the number of people in 2020, basically the numbers in 2024 matched what the way Asian Americans voted in 2016. So basically he lost support in 2020 and then he regained it in 2024. So maybe that's just part of a political pendulum. I don't know. But I think that needs to be said. And when you talk about the House races, about how only 4 seats separate Republicans from Democrats, part of the reason why it's so close is the 2 of the last called races were in California involving 2 Asian American candidates, Derek Tran and Dave Min. They both won their races. They both gave additional seats to Democrats. Without those 2 candidates in Southern California, which traditionally votes more conservative than Northern California, there will be even a wider gap between Democrats and Republicans. So I think it may be too soon to say the coalition is broken. I just think that it's just part of the political process and we need to work things out.
I think when you look at the affirmative action case that took place at the Supreme Court, there was, of course, a white guy behind it, but he used an Asian group to push it. And so, we can't ignore what we see right in front of us and some of the things that we see different groups doing against each other and allowing themselves to be pitted against each other, and it ends up hurting everybody in the end. And so, I'm looking at some of the factual things that I see in Philadelphia. We just had a big thing about the Sixers arena. And the neighborhood that was under threat was Chinatown. And so you had black coalitions of people and other people coming together to say we need to save Chinatown. I just wish I would have seen that same energy when black communities were under threat from Chinatown, right? Coming to our community and saying we got to save the black community. I didn't see that. And so I think what needs to happen is that everybody needs to recognize what their own interests are. And then I think beyond that, we have to figure out where we can come together, not try to have an artificial coalition where we're together on everything, because we're not, and figure out the areas where we can agree and really focus on those.
I do want to talk about a story that I wrote after the election and the exit polls all came out. I do want to address some slight misinformation. So in the NBC poll that most of us probably saw that did the exit polls, it said that Native people voted 65% for Donald Trump. If you look at the numbers, that number is statistically inaccurate. They only took a survey of, I think, around 200, maybe at most 400 Native people. And those Native people, first of all, were self-identifying, and I'll get into kind of the logistics of that in a moment. But none of those exit polls were taken on tribal lands. So, like I said earlier, there is a very, not a very big difference, but there is a difference nonetheless between the issues that Native people care about most between those who live on res and those who live off. So when Native News Online, we did our own exit poll, we actually found that the numbers were actually closer to 50-50. I think it was 51% voted for Trump and 49% voted for Harris. So again, that 50-50 split that we are most used to seeing when we talk about American politics, because we have that narrative that America is, 50-50, right? And so that was not unsurprising. Donald Trump did win the election, so those were the numbers I was expecting. But I do want to say we also did 3 other polls on top of that one. So one before the debate, when Biden was still in the race, so that those results were kind of null and void after it came out that he was no longer running. And then one after the debate, and then one right before the election. And so after the debate, we saw that Native people were leaning towards Harris. Before the debate, when it was still Biden, the numbers were leaning towards Trump. And then right before the election, the numbers were also leaning towards Trump. But again, it was still those narrow margins between like maybe 49, 51 at best. But then when we look on our survey, we separated our data. We asked a ton of demographic questions, one of those being, do you live on res or off res? And so when we looked at the results and we saw that when we looked at the people specifically who lived on res, overwhelmingly around 90% of them said that they were going to vote for Harris. And so that is a big thing, and I wanted to kind of challenge that narrative because I want to make sure that we're all on level footing here, so we're not going, oh my gosh, all the Indians voted for Trump, they're the right, when that's just not true. But unfortunately, that is the narrative that mainstream media chose to stick with. And so I wrote the story, kind of challenging that, and that was something I did all election season, was challenging the major narratives, both on the Democrat and Republican side. But to kind of talk more about what self-identifying means. So the NBC poll, they relied on self-identification, so just people who said, oh yeah, I'm Native. And that's great. But there are a lot of nuances. And so when we were doing these polls, we had to get into this conversation of, well, how do we define who is Native? While also recognizing the various policies, the assimilationist and genocidal policies that have led us to having to even ask that question in the first place. So there's people who are Native, who maybe don't know anything about being Native because they were, put in the foster care system, or they went to boarding schools, or they moved to the cities during the relocation era, right? And so not everyone is also a tribal citizen. Me, myself, I'm not a tribal citizen, but I am a direct descendant. My mother is a tribal citizen. So there's like that clear thing. So am I going to say I'm not Native? I don't. I am very much Native, right? And so in our poll, we asked two questions. Are you a descendant or are you a citizen? Yes or no? And then the next question was, please list your tribal affiliation. And so I then had to go through the data. We tried to get a sample size of 1,000, because that's a decent sample size, but unfortunately, sometimes had to go a little bit under, just because surveying Indian country is very difficult. Getting out to Indian country is very difficult. And so I myself had to go through all of the respondents and look at those two questions. Are you a descendant or citizen? And your tribal affiliation, and find the discrepancies. So some people would say, I'm a citizen, and then when they were asked what their tribe was, they said they didn't have one. So that tells to me that they're not Native, and maybe Levi calls them pranksters. But I then had to go through that, and that question kept coming up over and over again, is how do we define who is Native? Do we define it based on the amount of intergenerational trauma that we all carry? Do we define it based on who carries a card? Or do we define it on blood quantum, which is a fake science, by the way? Or do we, define it on, how do we, or do we define it on, I say I'm a part of that community, so I am. And so those were a lot of the questions we had to ask, and those are the kind of issues that we are kind of experiencing within our own community. And so when we talk about numbers, it's very easy to say, oh, all Native people voted 65% or 51% if you want to talk about the more accurate number. And
So I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts on this question. And I get that this is it's a heavy question, it's a stressful question, but what you said about the discrepancies with the polling data from NBC versus what you saw, it reminded me of a conversation, my podcast, I spoke with someone on the history, the tension, the solidarity, all of that between Black and Asian American communities. And the expert, who I cannot remember her name for the life of me, she said something that, she said white supremacy is like Wile E. Coyote. It does all of these nefarious things, and then it gets away before Bugs Bunny ever catches him. And that's just kind of what this reminds me of, this having folks self-identify as indigenous versus going to the source. But not to put you both on the spot, but I'd love to hear what you think about whether or not the BIPOC coalition is dead. And then we're gonna start to take questions.
I was gonna say that I think there's way too many people organizing and who have been organizing for a long, long, long time to say that the coalitions are dead or that the coalition is dead. I think we're coalition building right now. And I think Pulso belongs to a lot of coalitions. But I will say that one thing that I definitely agree with Solomon on is that we do need to, maybe look within our own community a bit more and do that work there first as we can, or in parallel to coalition building. So, I'm not surprised that Latinos voted the way that the polls said they do, because we have a media outlet where we do a lot of community management. We spend a lot of time in the comments to speak to specific series that we've done. For example, we had this series going on every Monday where we would pose a question to our audience on Instagram and folks would chime in the comments. And so one of the last ones we did before around election time was about the comedian in New York. And so we asked, should comedians have to apologize for, I forget how we phrased it exactly, but that's the way that we were having conversations with our audience. And I mean, we know this audience really well. We spend a lot of time in the comments. We speak to them on many different platforms. We know that Latinos have a variety of political opinions. And so yeah, that Puerto Rico was like garbage in the ocean or something like that. Yeah, I couldn't remember exactly in the moment, but yeah, it was, right. There's been so many things. There's a long list. So, even within those comments, even when someone is insulting Puerto Rico or insulting a specific community, we still have folks in our comments saying, well, it's comedy, it's supposed to be this. We had overwhelmingly the opinion was, yes, he should. That was not comedy. But you see that. And so I think that we had a good pulse on what was happening with our audience as far as that. I think, when you say something like, why would Latinos vote for Trump even though immigration, it doesn't surprise me being a Latina that immigration is not a deal breaker for some people, because some folks don't have immigration stories. There's a lot of Latinos that live in the Southwest and in California who have been here for generations, and in some places before the U.S. was a country. So I think that underscores for me the importance of understanding our community very well and the nuances of our community. I will say, for as far as doing the work, I even think that to myself. A couple of my family members, extended family members, definitely voted for Trump, whether they admitted it or not. And I was surprised, and I think I was surprised because my grandparents on my dad's side, who immigrated to the U.S. in the 60s, have always been really staunch Democrats. I mean, always voted, always look forward to voting. It's I think that's where I learned that voting was important. And so it never occurred to me that maybe one of their children would vote for Trump. And I think that what we learned about our own community in this was that we need to be having more conversations with people in our family. My family is very mixed status, mixed income level, mixed education level, but still, I was still surprised. And I think that, that just speaks to how many conversations folks are not having, even within their own communities. And I think that work needs to take place in parallel to do effective coalition building. I had another thought, but I'm losing it. Basically, I think we need to speak to each other more, especially men. I will say that. Obviously, when it comes to Latinos and Latino voting, we all know that Latina women voted very differently than Latino men. And I think that was a surprise for a lot of people in mainstream media, maybe not for Latina women who have been in these communities and families and speak to the men in our community all the time. But it definitely underscored for me, at least, how much work I have to do to understand my own small circle as I also try to coalition build with others.
Before you go to questions, I'm not letting you escape this question.
Okay.
Is the BIPOC coalition dead?
I don't think the BIPOC coalition is dead. I think the elephant in the room that no one is saying yet. I think each election cycle, when we talk about coalition building, the underlying question that no one is asking, or the thing that our collective goal is, I think what we're all trying to do is get people, or how do we get people, the entire coalition, to vote in similar numbers as, in the way that Black women vote, right? What would Black women do? That's what we're all trying to do, right? That's the collective goal, right? If everyone, the entire, community, all of our communities, all of the Black and brown community, Asian American, Latino community, if they'd all voted 92% for democracy, not necessarily specifically for a specific candidate, not Kamala Harris, but to save our democracy, next week would look much different.
Right.
That's the underlying goal. And, I want to talk about white women, even though they're not a part of the BIPOC coalition, right? But they are part of the women coalition that we're trying to build. One of the undertold stories, I think, of this election cycle is, Kamala Harris, her campaign made inroads among white women this election. I know we like to say, the 53% they voted for Trump, what are they doing? And yes, it's, they can do better, much better. But what we aren't talking about is the fact that I think, I'm trying to think of the numbers. I think it was Clinton, right? Hillary Clinton, and then there was Biden, and then there was Kamala Harris. So Trump has had 3 general election campaigns, right, in a row. And I think that's historic. I don't know if anyone else has run 3 times in a row in a general election, but he did, right? Kamala Harris performed better with white women than Hillary Clinton did, than Joe Biden did. Right, and she improved. I think Joe Biden. What did he get? She improved 2 points over Joe Biden with white women, or 2 to 3 points, just depending on what poll you look at. And that's significant in that. Given what we were up against this election cycle, given his messages intended to scare white women, right? We've been asking them each election cycle to vote like Black women, right? We've been asking them to talk to their communities to get them to vote in the right way, right? And we've just made the assumption that maybe it isn't working, right? They're just never going to do the right thing. I think that we should pay attention to these small nudges in the right direction, right? Because Kamala Harris, like I said, she made inroads. If you go all the way back to Barack Obama's election in 2012, the second election, I think he was way, way down with white women, right? I think 4 points. I think she improved 4 points over Barack Obama, Kamala Harris. And that's, nothing to sneeze at. And so I think that going into this, next election cycle, 2026 and 2028, in addition to asking them to vote like Black women, to listen to Black women, to talk to their other white women in their communities, maybe we should ask ourselves, are we leveraging the privilege of our allies in the best way, right? What should we be asking of them to help us, right? What are those questions we should be asking of them, and what are our asks of them? In addition to voting like Black women, in addition to talking to their communities, they have privilege that is valuable to us that we should be using and we should be leveraging. And I just want to go out with that note and that thought.
Are there any questions before? Okay, I saw your hand up first.
I'm sorry.
Oh, wait, no, there's a mic.
Thank you. It's really great to hear from all of you. You all brought up the idea that BIPOC is a little all-encompassing and doesn't encourage us to think about the differences within communities, obviously. The other difference, I think, and I'm wondering what you all think about this, is I don't think we look at enough at class differences within communities. And looking at the Indian American community, if you ever see any coverage of Indian American people with regard to politics, they're all professionals, they're all middle class, upper middle class, they're all supposed to be the same. And then you can shock one of your aunties and uncles who complain about immigration, and you tell them, well, you know that the country number 3 with the most number of undocumented immigrants in America is India, and it blows their mind. And I just think that the class conversation needs to be had in addition when we think about these coalitions. I'm wondering what you think about. I mean, I don't know enough about res communities versus off-res communities, but I would imagine that there's an economic class difference there. So I'm just curious, and the Latino community is broad in so many ways. I'm just wondering what you think about the role of class in building this community.
I totally agree with you that it's a central point. I'm thinking of all the hilarious TikToks I saw after the election. The TikTok after the election was a great place to be in. But one of the memes that I saw was that I saw within the Latino community was Latinos start earning like 60,000 plus and forget to be Democrats, or like start voting for Donald Trump. That was probably the funniest meme I saw, and I was like, I want to send this to my relatives, but like, but you know, I don't want to start like another war right before the holidays. So absolutely, I think that's a case. I think what Sierra said earlier about people being broke and what like people's perceived realities is their truth. So what you have the government saying like, the economy is very strong, the economy is very strong, and that was like the phrase that they kept repeating over and over and over again, ignoring all the comments in community media being like, well, actually, okay, like macro, yeah, sure, it's strong, but I'm struggling with buying my groceries, I'm struggling with this. I do think that that had a large role to play, and I think that as an outlet, something we've been thinking about is how we can be more explicit in naming those things, because maybe we talked about them overall, but I don't think we really named explicitly like, yes, this economic insecurity is what's driving people to vote for Trump, and that doesn't necessarily make them bad people, that they have economic insecurity. Like, we have to acknowledge that that's their reality, and you can. We've been dabbling with this idea of how do you, is it misinformation and disinformation, or is it getting people to accept the truth? And that's like, I don't know if this is making sense to you all, but all of these are tied for me. But I do think class is a major factor, especially within the Latino community. But I will say that I think there are other factors at play for Latinos as well, but I think class is a big one. And I think everything Sierra said was on point.
I'm sorry. I think class is a huge issue in the Black community, in that you have a lot of people who are like, I'm Black, but I'm not Black like you, right?
Right.
And so people are constantly trying to separate themselves from the African diaspora by either having more money or pretending that they have more money than they do, or using their possessions to try to separate themselves. And I think what we find out is that, you know, you rich till the cops come. And so there are some issues that I think affect all of us, but we are so busy trying to separate ourselves from each other that it becomes easier for other people to separate us. It was easy for Donald Trump to get on the stage with the NABJ and say, well, you know, Kamala Harris just turned Black. And Black people was on social media like, yeah, she just turned Black. I'm like, oh, she went to HBCU. You know, she pledged in a Black sorority. Like, if you look at pictures of her from when she was a kid, her hair is done in Black hairstyles. Like, what are you talking about? But it was easy for Black people to believe that because we are very busily trying to separate ourselves by class, and so it becomes easier for other people to do it.
You know, before we take that, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, this question was difficult for me because I disagree to an extent with the Black community. So yes, we have class differences, but when it comes to voting, that does not affect the way that we vote, right? We vote collectively for the community. 92% of Black women voted for Kamala Harris. And like I said, there's no one more broke than Black women, right? So class aside, we still managed to do the right thing.
3 out of 10 young Black men voted for Trump, despite the fact that young Black men are more likely to be shot and killed by the police than anybody else. 21 times more likely than their white counterparts. And so there are some class differences. I think there's some informational differences in the Black community. I think we have to kind of accept some of that and accept that there are some folks who want to be different. I think that's misogyny too, but I also think that it was them saying, look, we were rich when Trump was in, you know. And we want to be rich again. And that was one of the things that I kept hearing as I went out and reported on this and talked to these young brothers, that they were like, nah, we were rich, and so we're going to be rich. And then race won't matter if we're just rich.
Which I'm gonna, before we go to your question, I actually want to talk right on that. I will admittedly say that's what I heard from my younger brother, who was 27 years old. Trump gave me a check, I had money. But I do think this actually hits right into a question I want to ask before we take your question, which is misinformation and disinformation. We've talked a lot about social media on this panel. We've seen, last week, Facebook said they're getting rid of fact checkers to be more like Twitter. It feels like our communities are so often the targets of misinformation. In the last panel, Mitra asked Don Lemon whether or not he was a part of Black Twitter. And what I thought about, I don't know if you all remember this, I'm sure you do, and I'm sure you do, but sometime last year, Biden invited the Black press to DC. And when I looked at the photos of who was there, no shade if anybody reads the Shade Room, but it was the Shade Room. And like not people I would necessarily consider journalists, regardless of whether or not that's a capital J or lowercase j. So that being said, considering it feels like, again, our communities are so targeted by misinformation and disinformation, how do we rise above these echo chambers? How do we fix this in our communities as purveyors of information?
There are a number of community groups, I'll mention one in San Francisco, Chinese for Affirmative Action, that has tackled misinformation in the Chinese language community. Whereas they go out and they seek out the misinformation and they counter it in the Chinese language. But with Facebook basically disavowing themselves from having to correct anybody and leaving everyone up to self-moderation, it really puts a lot more pressure on us as media to try to call this stuff out. And it's a scary thing to do because when you call somebody out, you're opening up yourself to charges of being biased. You're opening up yourself to charges of trying to censor the right. People are just like wedded to their opinions. I'll give you one example, and I was scared to do it, but it actually turned out okay, is someone posted a photo of Andy Kim, the new US Senator from New Jersey, going through his oath of office. And the photo showed Andy Kim crossing his fingers like this. The implication being that when he was taking the oath to allegiance to the United States, that he was basically saying, I don't accept that oath. And that's what the caption read underneath the picture. And that was posted on our Facebook feed at AsAm News. And I saw that, and I said, there's no way. And I looked at the photo really carefully, and I compared it to other photos that were taken of Andy Kim taking the oath of office. And there was a slight difference in the background. The background was blurred out, but I could tell it was not the same background as the photos I was seeing in the mainstream media. So basically, I took a chance and called it out and said, there's something wrong with this photo. I don't believe this photo is real because if you compare the background to this photo to the background of other photos, it's not the same background. I was expecting that person to come back at me and attack us, because it was AsAm News that was saying this. That person took that picture down. So basically he had been called out or she had been called out and decided, I can't win this, I'm leaving now. So I'm still not comfortable calling out misinformation because I'm never 100% sure, but sometimes you just have to go with your gut and sometimes you have to take a chance. And God, I dread the day if I'm ever wrong and that's just, everyone's gonna come after me, but.
Right.
And before anyone else answers the question, I just want to also quickly say, going back to, 3 out of 10 Black men voting for Trump.
Young Black men.
Young Black men voting for Trump. With disinformation, putting aside misogynoir, because we know that's an issue, but putting aside misogynoir, going back to my brother, I told him, I'm a journalist. I still told him he was wrong. So when you answer, talk about disinformation, misinformation, keep in mind that even my brother, and I'm sure so many other of our brothers and sisters, it doesn't matter what we say, or they just aren't hearing us, but go ahead.
You're making me laugh because I'm thinking of my uncle who posted this meme that was like freedom, family, finances. And I was like, okay, well, I have an economics degree and I also have a master's in economics. I really want to explain this, but it doesn't matter. And I think that's where I was going with like accepting the truth. I think what we saw within our audience is that even when you do call out misinformation and disinformation, even when you provide sources, even when you can point people to very like factual places, sometimes people are still like, well, you're just saying this because you don't agree, or you're just saying this because you're biased. And so the issue that we're really thinking about now is like, how do we get people to accept that facts are facts, even when we share we're excited because we like. Our stuff is on Instagram. We still put, citations in our graphics that we make and our videos that we make. We've like experimented with different ways to share our works cited with people. And even in the face of that, people will still say, well, you must be making this up. I think part of it is that I think the right wing is really good at speaking to certain values that people hold near. So for example, Latinos, we really value working hard. And we're one of the largest groups of entrepreneurs in the country. And I think, unfortunately, like, they know how to message that in a way that really resonates with Latino men. The whole, like, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, like, we all know that's problematic. We all know there are a lot of factors that limit how much you can grow or, you know, move. So mobility is the word I'm looking for in this country. But people still buy into that, and it's just like a, I don't know, it's a cultural value, I guess, that they know how to speak to, or like family, or like religion. And so I think that the messaging is really on point in some ways, where we still need to work on that as a group, not just like Pulso, but as a group. And so, yeah, I'll just leave it with that.
That's the thing too. I think sometimes we kind of think that as journalists, first of all, we've all been taught that our main job as journalists is to provide the facts. No, not opinions and not interpretations of the facts, but the fact is that a lot of communities, and coming from a Native community, a lot of times when you put those facts out there, they don't know what to do with those facts. They don't know what those facts mean. Okay, I told you all about the Supreme Court case and the decisions and the arguments, but they don't know how to interpret that. What does that actually mean for Indian country specifically? What does that actually mean for America? Or what does that actually mean for your guys' communities? So, something Levi and I have talked about is being a sort of watchdog journalism. So we, you know, at Native News Online, we have a unique privilege in a sense that we, you know, being small, can choose how we want to, I guess, put out the facts. Because we understand that while education in our communities is slowly increasing, a lot of our community is, you know, does not have a college education. Maybe some of them struggle to even get through high school. And so we know that just putting the facts out there isn't enough. Just saying, okay, this is misinformation, here's the real facts, isn't enough. You also have to take that next step and say, okay, here's the facts. Here's what this could mean for you, your family, and your community, and the nation as a whole. Because at the end of the day, we've tried putting out the facts, and it just isn't working. And that is something, like you were touching on, the Republican Party does so well, is giving out their interpretation of those facts. And that's what resonates with the people, is they hear they can hear numbers all day, but those numbers don't mean anything until you say, here's the numbers, and this is what it could do for your family. Here's what it can do for your community. Here's what might happen. And that's what the Republicans do so well. And I think I think the Democratic Party, they kind of rely on, okay, a lot of us are educated. A lot of us are critical thinkers. You know, a lot of us have that ability to be ethical consumers of knowledge. But at the end of the day, not all of us have that privilege of being able to see those facts and know immediately what they mean. We also have to take that next step.
And look.
Sorry, only because we only have a few minutes left. There's a lot of questions, and so you'll hear here. What I'm going to say though is only one person answer a question, and keep it nice and tight so you can get everybody in.
Yep.
But we're not everyone, but most of us will still be sticking around afterwards. So any other questions?
Right.
All right. My name is Roland Roebuck. I'm not a journalist. I'm a community activist. My question is directly to Ms. Krysta Villeda in reference to, the reason why I say Villeda is to establish the fact that I'm Puerto Rican and I speak Spanish, Afro-Puerto Rican.
I knew from the way you said my name.
One of the main issues that is fracturing the Latino community is the high level of racism that exists, and that media and many of our leaders deny the fact that there is a high level of racism in our community. And I've been here since 1974, and the Salvadoran community has exerted a high level of racism towards us. And I am saying that in order to create a strong foundation, in order to advance coalition building, media needs to assume a responsible role in addressing that cancer of racism that is not advancing our interests. And as long as we continue with this sickening silence, we're not going to reach anywhere. So I encourage Pulso to assume a more responsible posture and address that publicly. Thank you very much. Lastly, in reference to that comedian that attacked our people, he has been banned from the island, and I know that during his travels, he will avoid landing in Puerto Rico. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right, 60 seconds.
First of all, I agree with you. And I love that you said that. So we definitely see that in our audience as well. I'm not denying that at all. We see a lot of racism in our community and also a lot of misunderstanding of how folks can both be Black and Latino. That's probably just as common. And so, for example, when we share a lot of that's one of the reasons why we share a lot of history content to kind of get folks to have these conversations. So an example I can give you is we share a lot of Caribbean history, like Dominican history and Puerto Rican history on our TikTok channel because our content creator that we work with is also Puerto Rican, Black, and from New York. And so his content focuses mostly on that. And you'll see in the comments when people are like, I thought you were Black, Anthony, or I thought you were Puerto Rican. I thought you were, and then he'll talk about a piece of Dominican history, and they'll be like, wait, but like, and then in the comments, you see people arguing about these facts. So we really do take our role of community management really important, not just in terms of the guidelines we have, but also, pushing back to our audience in the comments. Yes, we delete comments that are hateful. Yes, we have community guidelines. We will remind people of those, but I think it's also important to do the community management of having the conversation. So why do you think this? Or, hey, did you know? That's kind of the way that we tend to approach our content. Hey, did you know this person did this? Did you know this person did that? Did you know Black people have been in Latin America and many countries aside from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic for a very long time, just as much as we have a lot of Asian communities in Latin America, which a lot of people also don't know. So we share a lot of that in a history context, and that's part of the reason why we at Pulso have chosen not just to be like a news outlet, but more so focus on history and culture in our content and kind of use that to connect to current events and present things that are happening because it seems to be more digestible for folks.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off because I want to get at least one other question in. There was one question over here who's so patient.
Hey guys, good to see you. I'm Manny Smith, senior editor at Yahoo News and also vice president of the Philly Association of Black Journalists. First of all, to the panel, thank you guys for the bravery of having this discussion up here and bringing it and being so full and fruitful about it. My question is, as we talk about this subject, how do we get over the fear as cultural media of wanting to stick to the decorum of equality, right? And really allow conversations like this to happen for our viewers? Do you think that we miss an opportunity for them to have the discussion? I feel like when you see the growth of MAGA media beyond Fox News, it's not just one, it's like 4 or 5, and they're having these discussions every single day. And so it feels like, hey, while we're hesitating over here, maybe there might be an opportunity that we're missing to engage our audiences in a richer way.
Okay, we only have a few moments, so I'm going to ask everyone to answer shortly. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think the thing that's being ignored is social media. Right. Social media is where most young people get their news, and increasingly it's where everybody gets their news. And so you have to figure out, to the point of someone earlier, from an earlier panel, where your listeners, where your viewers are, and you have to meet them there. I think the other thing that matters is ownership. WURD is owned by Black people, right? And so that affects the way that we can tell our stories. Ownership matters. Donald Trump owns Truth Social. Elon Musk owns Twitter, right? And so, what you see is them affecting that ecosystem in ways that cause other people to say, you know what, truth doesn't matter here either, so you can come here too. We need to learn to have these conversations in a very real way, and we have to invest in owning the platforms that we have them on.
All right. I feel like we can get one more question in. I see a question back here. Oh, you with the hat on. Yeah. No, with the black shirt. Yes. Hold on. There's a mic coming now. We've got a whopping 4 minutes.
Good afternoon. Thanks. I wanted to ask the question, where do we go with covering elections, covering issues in elections? I thought that when Harris came out with her campaign for black men, as well as her housing plan, that those would kind of be game changers. They would be conversation starters. But for your communities, where did those conversations go? I mean, where did those positions go, those issues go as far as, becoming conversations in the community?
As Native people, this entire election, we have all said pretty much the same thing, that these conversations didn't start before the election, and these conversations aren't going to end after. So regardless of who's in office, a Democrat, Republican, Independent, etc., our issues don't change. The things we're advocating for don't change. So as Native people, something that we were, a narrative that we were trying to get out there is that you're not voting R for Republican, you're not voting D for Democrat, you're voting I for Indian or Indigenous. And so that is the thing. Elections, Judith LeBlanc says this a lot, that elections are just snapshots of where we are in our advocacy journey, in our political journey. It's just a snapshot, right? Donald Trump is only going to be president for the next 4 years. What happens after that? And that's the thing. A lot of times we want to think that conversations surrounding the election and the issues surrounding it start like a year before Election Day, which isn't true. These conversations need to continue. We need to start highlighting different policies that these politicians are pushing, or these conversations or these statements that these politicians are making, or maybe highlighting different politicians from different minority communities who plan to run or who are doing great things in their own community. The thing is, we need to continue these conversations. We can't just focus on the election when it's election season, because at the end of the day, we won't get anything done if we're starting and stopping these conversations.
All right, before we wrap, 1 sentence, last words from anyone. 1 sentence, fine,
Just
maybe
one sentence.
2.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to address her specific question about the black men's agenda, right, which I also thought would have a bigger impact than it did. And this is a semicolon, so it's 1 sentence.
Okay.
So I think that disinformation probably played a role there. I can talk to you about it offline, but it should have translated, that's another semicolon, but it did not. Okay.
That was one long, but still 1 sentence. Love it.
I would just like to invite anyone here who comes from in media that we would love to collaborate with you on issues that cross the intersectionality between issues and cover it from our community perspectives and see where there's a common ground and where there's disagreement and how we can work out those disagreements.
I would say community is really important as the foundation for all of this within our own family, within our own community, within partnerships, and check us out at Project Pulso on all platforms.
There you go. So you can check us out on the WURD Radio app, or WURDradio.com, and you can listen to me 7 o'clock tomorrow morning is why I got to get out of here. But the other thing is that all politics is local. We can't be consumed by what happens on the federal level. We can't be consumed by what happens with Donald Trump. We have to work within our own communities, work within our own listenership, readership, in order to bring about change and to build trust so that people are coming to us rather than going to social media.
I think something that this panel and this entire event as a whole has shown is that we need to move away from the black-white dichotomy when we're having these conversations surrounding advocacy issues, human rights issues, et cetera. And so with that, I encourage you all to check out your local or national or whatever Native News-owned website. Native people are everywhere, whether you guys see it or not. But for Native News Online, which can be your starting point, check us out at nativenewsonline.net.
All right, thank you all for chatting with us. Thank you. Y'all were great. So if anyone needs to take a quick bathroom break, go ahead, because we're going to jump into the next part of the programming. The live stream is going to end now. We're going to jump into the table talks. I'm going to turn this